I guess this naturally leads into a discussion of Kwame Brown, since he does talk a lot about meritocracy, I guess, from his perspective, right? I remember there was this one like very memorable sort of thing that he went on when somebody like accused him of like, oh, the only reason why you were a basketball player was because you were tall, right? You just got lucky. Whereas he argues is like, I came from the free lunch program. I grew up in a trap house. I had my mother down face down with an AK right to her back from cops, right, that were just kind of, invading the premises, right? And then he said something like, you think they only put short guys in prison, right? He doesn't use the word guys. He's like, they put short guys, they put tall guys, they put everybody in prison. And I'm fascinated by that kind of like inborn conservatism that he has, because unlike a type like a Ben Shapiro or a Candace Owens, it's clearly not a media creation. It's true, for instance, that Black people, they tend to vote heavily, for the Democrats. But if you really sit them down and you ask them questions about everything from like, sexuality to things like human effort, they do have conservative views on things like desire, right? They do have conservative views on things like effort. And that has to come from the fact that if you're growing up in an environment where, for like a Black male, right? Kwame Brown often says, we keep talking about Black girl magic. Where's Black boy magic? And I love that framing, because when you talk to like red pillars or like typical MRA types, they're never able to give like space to the idea that, oh yeah, men have it bad, even worse than women in America, but Black men have it worst of all, and it's not their fault. They're not able to give space to that because they're too right wing. They're not able to conceptualize things in such a way where they're the privileged ones and there's like subcategories between men, right? They don't think in those terms, but because of his upbringing, he is able to think in those terms. He is able to bring attention to the idea that, look, Black boys have very unique problems, that they're not being treated respectfully and appropriately. That's obviously true, right? I don't think anybody on the left could reasonably deny that, if they could sort of, take their emotions out of the picture when they, there's always like an abstract kind of feminism in the background that I think interferes with really just kind of like seeing, okay, if you say that, Black people have it so bad, what exactly do you mean by that? Right. And so he has this kind of like baked in conservatism that comes from the fact that you are growing up in an environment where your masculinity is always at stake. And that stake is not one of like, you'll have a little fight, right? It could literally end in murder, right? He has this one thing that he said that I thought was very useful, where he was like, just think about the fact that if you're a white man, you could go to any neighborhood that you want in any place in the country. And the worst that's going to happen to you is maybe someone's going to shout at you. And I mean, so Kwame Brown is like very aware of that. And he's like, a white man can walk in any neighborhood that he wants and nothing's going to happen to him. But if you're a Black man and you go into literally any neighborhood that's Black, that is not your own, or even a white neighborhood, obviously, right? You get lynched somewhere these days still. You're always in danger, right? If you say the wrong thing, if you don't answer questions the right way. And that obviously is going to breed a conservative feeling. And, I think he represents that well. And I've always found that pretty fascinating, that he's not like a media creation. And I could actually respect his conservatism, right? When he says like, oh, Black men, look at what the Mexicans are doing. You tell them to build a house, they build you a house in a week. You guys can't do that. What's going on? He's not saying that to tell Mexicans go back to your country. He's telling, Black people, you have to aspire to that. It's not the kind of, toxic Trumpist sort of like, idea of immigration. It's a very different kind of conservatism. When he talks about single mothers, he's like, people say, Black women empowerment, single mothers are wonderful. But really, the only reason they're saying that is eventually that mother is going to need a man, and then it comes attached with some strings attached. That's a very different framing from the typical red pill MRA kind of framing. And I could actually respect that. It comes from actual experience. It's not synthetic.
Yeah, I got fascinated when Kwame Brown became a major figure in NBA media. I've been a basketball fan since 1998. So I've always followed what's going on with hoops. And Kwame Brown started feuding with some guys in the media because they were calling him a bust. And they've always called him a bust, but he finally got fed up with it. Now that he's out of the league and he doesn't need another contract, He doesn't have to make sure that he comes across as a professional. So he's now free because he is done playing to openly criticize these people he used to be quiet around. And he makes an argument that sounds not altogether different from Fanon's argument about the black bourgeoisie, or Adolf Reed's argument about a kind of black professional class that claims to speak on behalf of the African American population, but often speaks for itself or speaks in a way which causes it to get hired or to keep its job, right? So Kwame is able to say, you guys position yourselves as authorities about black culture and who's doing well and who's not doing well, and you use it to criticize black men, and you do this because you're paid by your white daddy to do all of that. Now, all of that sounds like a perfectly mainstream, almost Marxist position, except for the fact that at the end it's white daddy and not the black bourgeoisie. There's no reference to class. Yeah, it always comes back to race for him because he has a race-conscious way of looking at the world. And if you're an American and you don't go to college, and Kwame Brown didn't go to college, he was one of the straight-out-of-high-school players. They don't make very many of those anymore, but Kwame Brown is one of them. The way that we tend to socialize people in our country is to think about the country is divided up into genders and divided up into races. So when someone who hasn't been through the education system tries to make sense of what's going on, if they're a smart person, and I think Kwame Brown is a bright guy, what they do is they construct a framing that divides it on the basis of race and on the basis of gender. And sometimes it doesn't have to be a hateful framing. Kwame Brown sometimes has very positive things to say about different racial groups or about women. It's not as if he has a hostile attitude to most of the groups he discusses, but at no point is he able to really get to the level of talking about class, because in our society, class is the suppressed thing that we never discuss openly. In the United States, we are always looking for some other way of talking about things that will produce divisions, that will prevent people from coming together to make demands. And we're very effective in this country. Our elite is very effective at doing that. And so I think Kwame Brown, who was immediately made fun of by all those media people, they frame him as absolutely crazy and kooky and he's lost his mind and all of that. And the fact that they said all of those things about him, when I was watching his videos, and I could see he has a position that is just an autodidact's position where race has replaced class. And that's really the only difference between him and a position that I would recognize as an erudite position that would come from a theorist who has been to school, right? That, to me, really hit home the power of that argument that comes from Fanon and from Adolf Reed about there being people who leverage their identity position to get into the professional class or into the ruling class. And once they get there, get really comfortable and really cushy and use it to kick away the ladder. And people can always identify this if it comes with an overtly right-wing aesthetic. If it's Clarence Thomas, everybody knows that's an Uncle Tom, that's what an Uncle Tom looks like. But when it's someone who pretends that they're interested in liberation, or pretends that they're interested in some kind of radical or progressive thing, that's when it becomes really deceptive. And there are a lot of Black professionals in the media who pitch themselves as progressive, but constantly push frames that break apart left-wing movements and pit people against each other. And they do it in the name of, say, an anti-racism, but it has the same function as racism, which is to erase racial consciousness and drown out and push out other forms of consciousness that might produce more genuinely emancipatory politics. I think Kwame Brown did an excellent job of highlighting that. It's unfortunate, however, that because he has no education at all, he's not able to arrive at a class-based understanding of the problem that he faces.
Well, I'm not even sure that education would necessarily change that at all. I mean, there's people with education.
Not in this country at this stage with the kind of education system we now have. There's an opportunity to read certain kinds of books at certain kinds of universities, but these universities are increasingly not accessible to most people. Like I said before, when we talk about affirmative action, we're really only talking about access to these very elite institutions, which is not the bulk of a type of university that most people go to. And then even within these elite institutions, there's an enormous emphasis these days on grant money, outside sources of money. There are partnerships with outside organizations, with think tanks and institutes that are not really properly academic organizations, that in previous periods would have been regarded as unethical for universities to be involved with these kinds of organizations and this kind of money. And at this point, that goes all the way up even to posh private universities that people think of as in some way immune or protected from the market incentives and the job incentives that dictate things at the ordinary state universities. At this point, it's just as bad, if not worse, further up the chain. It's very, very difficult for people to get access to Marxist political theory, or even say, to pre-liberal political theory, unless you're going into theology or medieval studies or classics. If you don't go into a very, very small number of disciplines that you'd be nuts to go into because they're not great disciplines for going to get a job, you're just not going to be introduced to all sorts of things. And then that also leaves people vulnerable to, when they do get introduced to history and they learn about ancient or medieval societies, this stuff can be taught in ways which is completely defacing to what actually happened, to the narratives and things that people in past societies actually believed. And people have no educational basis for questioning or challenging the things that they're getting. There's a lot of downstream kind of mid-level culture that masquerades as high culture, real education, that exists to trip people up and trap them in different kinds of bubbles and holes. And just as a lot of those are, autodidact bubbles that can happen when you're out on your own, there's also rump professionals who actively sell as expertise stuff that isn't really expertise.
Yeah, I think you could say that Kwame Brown has a racial analysis in lots of places, but also in other spots, he really, he kind of goes the opposite route, right? He often does say things like, I'm tired of talking about white people. Why is everybody always worried about white people, right? It's, if I walk through a black neighborhood, I have to worry about not a white person, but somebody that's black. But of course, we could say that, well, there's it's white people that made neighborhoods a certain way. But there's also other sort of it's seemingly class-based pieces to the analysis. Like his big thing, he always says, we need coding and we need trades in schools, right? And I do think that in terms of in the future, there is something about actual trades that will have to make a comeback, right? Because we keep squeezing, this juice from this kind of white collar rock, but there's less and less left. And yet there's more and more physical, infrastructural work that goes undone, right? We're already trillions behind in terms of required spending on this. And, that's not even taking into account things like climate. Yeah. I mean, a fascinating figure for many, many different reasons. By the way, if I clip out the Kwame Brown thing and make it public, do you want me to censor or to take out the Uncle comment? Because some people might consider that a racial slur.
Oh, Clarence Thomas is an uncle. I mean,
okay, so we could say that?
Yes, you could say that Clarence Thomas is an uncle. Who would disagree about that? Apart from people who really like Clarence Thomas, and those people aren't going to like me particularly very much. I mean, if you want to censor it to avoid having an association with the comment, I'd be okay with that. You don't have to run it.
Well, I have no problem saying that. I wouldn't physically say it on here simply because YouTube, I would probably censor the word, but I could make it clear that that's what we're saying. I have no issue with that analysis.
It's also possible that YouTube could YouTube could take an issue with it. Sometimes YouTube
I remember when I was doing a video on Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, I made a thing at the beginning. I was like, look guys, if you don't want me to say that big beautiful word, I'm reading him, right? So this is a prime beautiful anti-racist book, one of the best that you could find, right? So I'm actually going to pronounce the word as he's written it, because if James Baldwin, right, says it's one of the best books ever written and everybody should read it, if that's good enough for James Baldwin, who the fuck are you to tell me that I shouldn't say it, right? It's just stupid.